We cannot recommend more strongly a new piece by Nicholas Wade, who for more than 50 years has been one of the preeminent science writers in the world. For 30 years, Nicholas Wade worked for the New York Times. He edited the science section there, but this piece did not run in the New York Times. It ran on Medium. And the piece explains where this virus almost certainly came from. In it, Nicholas Wade makes it clear that more than any other single living American, Tony Fauci is responsible for the COVID-19 pandemic. Wade lays out a nearly insurmountably large amount of evidence that this virus originated at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in central China. It seemed to make sense. This show and others had raised the possibility from the early days of the pandemic. But this piece all but proves it. At the time the outbreak began last fall, the Wuhan lab was conducting experiments on how to make bat viruses infectious to human beings. Those experiments were funded by American tax dollars. Those experiments were, their funding, approved and directed by Tony Fauci in Washington. By Tony Fauci. That is hard to believe, but it's true, and the piece lays it out. Many of the Wuhan experiments fell under the direction of a Chinese researcher called Shi Zhengli, known as the Bat Lady. She was China's leading expert on bat-borne viruses. Her job was to genetically engineer coronaviruses so that they infect human beings and do so as easily as possible. This work, Nicholas Wade notes, involved, quote, doing gain-of-function experiments designed to make coronavirus infect human cells. Now, why was this research going on? We'll have to ask the scientists who did it. But the fact remains, these were some of the most dangerous experiments ever conducted by mankind. And yet we know that China was not taking necessary safety precautions, and we should not be surprised by that. Several years ago, American diplomatic cables warned about low and lax standards at the Wuhan lab. In fact, the Wuhan facility was classified as a biosafety level 2 laboratory. What does that mean? Well, according to Richard Ebright, who's a molecular biologist at Rutgers, that is approximately the same level of safety that you would find in a dentist's office in America. So that lab, conducting research, experiments on the coronavirus and how to make it transmissible to human beings, resulted almost certainly in the infection of a lab researcher, and the virus spread from there. The first coronavirus patients, in fact, did not come from the so-called wet market, as we heard. That was a lie. The first patients of the coronavirus, in fact, were employees at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, at the lab. So once again, why would the Wuhan lab be conducting experiments like that in the first place? Well, we know that Tony Fauci had authorized payment for the research. For 5 years, from 2014 to 2019, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which Tony Fauci runs and has for decades, pumped money to a group called the EcoHealth Alliance. The EcoHealth Alliance is run by a man whose name you may recognize, Dr. Peter Daszak. Daszak contracted with Dr. Shi to conduct gain-of-function experiments at the Wuhan lab. Just before the pandemic became public knowledge, on December 9th, 2019, Peter Daszak sat for an interview that was streamed online. In that interview, Daszak bragged about how easy it is to manipulate coronaviruses in lab experiments.
Coronaviruses are pretty good. I mean, you're a virologist, you know all this stuff, but you can manipulate them in the lab pretty easily. It's just spike protein drives a lot of what happens with the coronavirus, zoonotic risk. So you can get the sequence, you can build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this. Insert it into a backbone of another virus, and do some work in the lab.
So just days after that was shot, it became clear that this new version of coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, what we now call COVID-19, was running rampant through Wuhan, then China, and then the world. Since then, since the pandemic began, Peter Daszak, not surprisingly, has appeared on virtually every media platform available to him to deny, in the most strenuous and dismissive terms, that the Wuhan lab could be in any way linked to the outbreak, since, of course, he has very personal motives for claiming that. Quote, "The idea that this virus escaped from a lab is just pure baloney," he said last year. But that was a lie. It's not pure baloney. And a lot of smart people knew that right away. One of those people is Alina Chan, a molecular biologist at the Broad Institute at Harvard and MIT. She bravely wrote a paper about how the coronavirus's genome hadn't changed much over time, and that was odd, because that genome had gone through trillions of replications. According to Chan, that fact implied that the virus was designed for human-to-human transmission from the outset. The former director of the CDC also clearly understood this, and he too argued that the virus came from the Wuhan lab.
I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
Millions of people have died of COVID-19. So it's not a matter of score settling or blame assignment to figure out where it came from. If you want to prevent the next global pandemic, you have to figure out how this one started. And so the World Health Organization said it would get to the bottom of it. The World Health Organization, of course, is beholden to China. And so it tried to hide the basic facts of the origins of this pandemic. And to hide those facts, WHO appointed none other than Peter Daszak as the only America-based representative on the investigative team looking into where the virus came from. In what turned out to be a sham report, that team concluded that it's, quote, extremely unlikely that the virus came from the Wuhan lab. Again, that's not true. The WHO's investigation into the origins of the virus was fraudulent, and that matters to public health globally. But one thing you'll notice is that Tony Fauci did not say that. Why? Because once again, he is implicated in it personally. The gain-of-function research that Peter Daszak was bragging about in the video we just showed you had in fact been banned explicitly by the US government. There was a federal moratorium on the funding of exactly the kind of gain-of-function experiments that went on in the Wuhan lab to disastrous effects. So why didn't the US government halt its funding of the lab in Wuhan? That is a central question, and Nicholas Wade, to his great credit, looked into it. And here's what he found. Quote, someone wrote a loophole into the moratorium. The moratorium specifically barred funding of any gain-of-function research that increased the pathogenicity of the flu, MERS, or SARS viruses. But then a footnote on page 2 of the moratorium document states that, quote, an exception from the research pause may be obtained if the head of the U.S. government funding agency determines that the research is urgently necessary to protect the public health or national security. And that's exactly the loophole that was exploited. Who signed off on this? Tony Fauci, possibly along with Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, invoked that special exemption in order to keep funding the Wuhan lab and the deadly experiments that were going on there. The experiments that clearly went so wrong. According to Richard E. Bright, quote, unfortunately, the NIAID director, that'd be Fauci, and the NIH director exploited this loophole to issue exemptions to projects subject to pause, preposterously asserting that the exempted research was, quote, urgently necessary to protect public health or national security, and thereby nullifying the pause. This wouldn't have happened if Tony Fauci didn't allow it to happen. That is clear. It's an amazing story. It is a shocking story. In a functional country, there would be a criminal investigation currently underway into Tony Fauci's role in the COVID pandemic that has killed millions and halted our country and changed it forever. So why isn't there a criminal investigation into Tony Fauci's role in this pandemic? Mike Gallagher is a member of Congress from the state of Wisconsin. We're happy to have him on the show tonight. Congressman, thanks so much for coming on. To read this piece by Nicholas Wade, who I think is as eminent as any science writer in the world, it makes me wonder, why didn't we know this before, and why isn't any law enforcement agency doing anything about it?
Well, Tucker, if you'll remember a year ago when those of us were suggesting that the lab leak hypothesis just needed to be investigated, we weren't saying that it was the correct hypothesis. We were called bigots, we were called tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists, and the problem, and the mainstream media did everything possible to spread CCP propaganda and shut the voices of those who merely wanted that hypothesis investigated because a global pandemic completely overturned and destroyed our lives and forever changed our country. But now we know that there may have been U.S. taxpayer funding that went to gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the evidence continues to stack up in favor of the lab leak hypothesis. Even China's version of the CDC dismissed the wet market hypothesis. So why won't the mainstream media ask basic questions of Dr. Fauci, given that they have him on every single Sunday show every week? Instead, he gets asked questions about seasonal mask wearing and how we're going to have 80% of Americans vaccinated and kids are going to have to be vaccinated. They're asking him every question except for the questions that matter. We need to get to the bottom of this, if for no other reason, as you suggested, we can't allow this to happen again. And more to the point, there are those proposing that we are going to increase funding from over $200 million to $1.2 billion for gain-of-function research. That would be insane if indeed the lab leak hypothesis is correct, as I think the evidence suggesting it might be.
I think I've misread the story from the first day. I imagined that the media blackout on the origins of coronavirus was designed to protect the Chinese government. But the U.S. government is implicated in this deeply. The story that Wade tells is of incompetence on the Chinese side and then lying and authoritarian, all the kind of predictable Chinese government behavior. But on the American side, you see people going around a moratorium on dangerous experiments, Tony Fauci signing off on it. And those are the people, the Americans who made this possible, whose, I would call them crimes, are being covered up by the media in this country.
And to put Daszak on the WHO investigatory team makes absolutely no sense, because he has a clear conflict of interest. His entire livelihood, his entire professional reputation is bound up in the very idea of gain-of-function research. We had other American citizens nominated to be on that team that the Chinese effectively vetoed, and they put Daszak on the team. Even the head of the WHO, Dr. Tedros, said that the investigation was incomplete and we need to examine the lab leak hypothesis. Again, I don't see a more pressing question in the world, and the fact that people in the media, people in our own government don't want to get to the bottom of it is a failure on every level. One thing they could do, Tucker, is declassify all the intelligence immediately. The Biden administration can do that, get it out there, full transparency.
This is criminal. I mean, if you were mixing dangerous chemicals in your basement and you blew up the neighborhood and killed thousands of people, you would be criminally liable for that. And saying it was a mistake wouldn't be enough to get you out of those charges. This is criminal. I don't think there's any question. Congressman, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Mike Gallagher of Wisconsin. Speaking of amazing stories, the Daily Mail has uncovered text messages between Hunter Biden and an assistant who appears to have ties to China's intelligence agencies. And in some of them, that woman, that apparently assistant who had ties to Chinese intelligence, is giving Hunter Biden advice on his father's presidential campaign. The reporter who broke that story has new information for us tonight. He joins us in a moment. Now, we're not exactly sure when the Daily Mail, which some of us used to make fun of, started breaking more real news than the Washington Post and the New York Times, but that's clearly the case now. And if you don't read it, check it out and you'll see that's true. Daily Mail reported last week on messages between Hunter Biden and an assistant who apparently has been tied to the intelligence services of China. Those messages included advice for Joe Biden's 2020 presidential campaign. We want to go right to the reporter who broke that story tonight.